The dust kicked up around her boots as Julia Mitchell slammed the barn door shut, her hands trembling with rage and something deeper she refused to name. Behind her, Ethan Cross stood in the fading light of another Texas sunset, hat in his hands, waiting with the kind of patience that made her want to scream. She'd thrown his kindness back at him, told him to leave her property and never come back, used words sharp enough to cut through leather. But when she turned around, expecting to see an empty yard, he was still there, still waiting, still watching her with those steady brown eyes that saw too much. And that's when he said the 5 words that would change everything between them forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn of 1889 had settled over Clearwater Valley like a heavy quilt, all golden browns and rust-colored leaves that clung stubbornly to the cottonwood trees before surrendering to the wind. The Mitchell Ranch sat nestled in a bend of Willow Creek, its weathered buildings casting long shadows across fields that had once been green with promise but now lay fallow, overgrown with thistle and wild grass that spoke of neglect and dreams deferred. Julia Mitchell stood at the kitchen window, her reflection ghost-like in the glass, watching the morning mist rise from the creek bed. At 26, she carried herself with the rigid posture of someone who had learned that softness was a luxury she couldn't afford. Her dark auburn hair was pulled back severely, not from vanity but from necessity, and her hands bore the calluses of a woman who had taken on work meant for stronger backs and willing hearts. The house around her told stories in its silence. Empty rooms that had once echoed with laughter now held only dust motes dancing in shafts of sunlight. The dining room table, built to seat 8, bore the ring stains of solitary coffee cups and the scratches where she'd sat alone, working on ledgers that never seemed to balance, no matter how many times she reworked the numbers. 3 years. 3 years since the fever had taken her parents within a week of each other, leaving her with a ranch too big for one person and debts that seemed to multiply in the darkness like weeds after rain. 3 years of watching neighbors pitying, glances when she came to town, of listening to whispered conversations that stopped when she entered the general store, of feeling the weight of their unspoken questions. Why hasn't she sold? Why doesn't she marry? Why does she insist on fighting a battle she can't possibly win? The coffee in her cup had long since grown cold, but she held it anyway, needing something solid to anchor her hands as she watched a rider approach along the winding dirt road that led to her front gate. Even from a distance, she recognized the easy way he sat his horse, the broad shoulders that never seemed to carry the weight of worry that bent most men's backs, the unhurried pace that spoke of someone who had learned that most of life's urges were illusions. Ethan Cross. Her jaw tightened involuntarily. Of all the people who might choose to darken her doorstep on this particular morning, when the bank notice lay crumpled in the kitchen drawer and the last of her father's cattle were scheduled to be auctioned next week, it had to be him. The man who never seemed to understand that some people didn't want to be helped, that some battles were meant to be fought alone, that his persistent kindness was more a burden than a blessing. She'd known him since childhood, back when their families had been neighbors and friends, when summer evenings meant shared suppers on wide porches and children's laughter echoing across the fields. Back when her father and his had talked about joining their spread someday, maybe through marriage, maybe through partnership. Back when the future had seemed as endless and reliable as the Texas sky. But that was before the drought that had lasted 2 seasons and killed half the cattle, before her father had borrowed against the land to keep them afloat. Before the fever that had come with the traveling medicine show and spread through the valley like wildfire, taking the old and the young and leaving the survivors to pick up pieces that no longer fit together the way they once had. Ethan's family had weathered those storms better. Their ranch, the Double Cross, sprawled across the valley's eastern slope, its boundaries marked by solid fence posts and healthy cattle that dotted the hillsides like scattered coins. They'd offered help, of course. After the funeral, Ethan had appeared regularly, mending fences she hadn't asked him to fix, bringing supplies she was too proud to accept, leaving quietly when she made it clear his presence wasn't welcome. But he kept coming back, week after week, month after month, with the kind of stubborn persistence that made her want to scream. He'd show up with fresh bread from his sister's kitchen, claiming he was just passing by, though his ranch was 5 miles in the opposite direction from anywhere he might reasonably be passing to. He'd arrive during storms to check on her livestock, ignoring her protests that she could handle her own animals. He'd appear at the general store just as she was struggling to load heavy supplies into her wagon, offering help she'd refuse, even as she secretly relieved to see his familiar face. The worst part wasn't his help. The worst part was the way he looked at her. Not with pity, not with the calculating assessment of a man sizing up a potential acquisition, but with something that felt dangerously close to understanding. As if he saw past the brittle shell she'd built around herself to something underneath that she'd thought was safely buried. Now he was at her gate, dismounting with the fluid grace that had always marked his movements, tying his horse to the post with hands that were gentle but certain. He paused there for a moment, looking up at the house, and even from her position at the window, she could see the way his shoulders straightened, as if he were preparing for battle. Julia stepped back from the window, setting her cold coffee on the counter with hands that shook only slightly. She could pretend not to be home, could wait in the shadows until he gave up and rode away, but that would only postpone the inevitable. Ethan Cross wasn't the kind of man who gave up easily, and she was tired of hiding from fights she couldn't avoid forever. She walked to the front door and opened it just as his boot touched the bottom step of her porch. He stopped there, hat already in his hands, brown hair slightly mussed from the wind. Up close, she could see the lines that worry and weather had carved around his eyes, the way his jaw was set with the kind of determination that had probably served him well in the war everyone knew he'd fought but never talked about. Julia, his voice was steady, warm, infuriatingly patient. Ethan, she kept her own voice, cool, professional. Little early for a social call, isn't it? He glanced at the sun, which was barely clearing the eastern hills. Figured you'd be up. You always were an early riser, the casual reference to their shared past, to a time when he'd known her daily rhythms because their families had been entwined like the roots of old trees, sent an unexpected spike of something hot and sharp through her chest. She wrapped her arms around herself, a barrier as much psychological as physical. What do you want, Ethan? He studied her face with those steady brown eyes, and she had the uncomfortable feeling that he was reading things she'd rather keep hidden. Heard Peterson was over here yesterday, heard he brought papers. Of course he'd heard. In a valley this small, news travelled faster than wildfire, and bad news travelled fastest of all. Julia lifted her chin, meeting his gaze directly. My business with the bank isn't your concern. Maybe not, he said quietly, but you are. The simple words hit her like a physical blow, and she took an involuntary step backward. This was exactly what she'd been afraid of. This assumption that her problems were somehow his to solve, that her life was somehow his responsibility. She'd been fighting this battle alone for 3 years, had learned to depend on no one but herself, and she wasn't about to start now. I didn't ask for your concern, she said, her voice sharper than she'd intended. I don't need it, and I don't want it. Something flickered in his expression. Hurt, maybe, or disappointment, but it was gone so quickly she might have imagined it. I know you didn't ask, he said, but that doesn't change anything. It changes everything. The words came out harder than she'd meant them to, edged with 3 years of accumulated frustration and fear. I'm not some helpless widow who needs rescuing, Ethan. I'm not my mother, content to lean on whatever man happens to be convenient. I've been taking care of myself and this ranch just fine without your help. Have you?" The question was gentle, but it landed like an accusation. His eyes moved past her to the sagging porch rail, the peeling paint on the shutters, the yard where weeds grew tall between the flagstones. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're drowning." The truth of it hit her like cold water, and she reacted with the fury of someone who'd been exposed. "Get out." Her voice was deadly quiet. "Get off my property and don't come back." But instead of mounting his horse and riding away, instead of giving her the space she'd demanded, Ethan Cross did something that caught her completely off guard. He set his hat on the porch rail, settled himself on the top step, and looked up at her with an expression of such calm determination that it took her breath away. "No," he said simply. The single word hung in the morning air between them, and Julia felt something inside her chest crack open. "What did you say?" "I said no." His voice was still gentle, but there was steel underneath it now. "I'm not going anywhere, Julia. You can yell at me, you can insult me, you can tell me to leave until you're blue in the face, but I'm not going anywhere." She stared at him, speechless for a moment, her mind scrambling to process this unexpected defiance. Ethan Cross had always been accommodating, had always respected her wishes, had always retreated when she made it clear his presence wasn't welcome. This quiet rebellion was something entirely new. "You can't just decide that," she said, but her voice had lost some of its edge. "Can't I?" He leaned back against the porch post, settling in as if he planned to stay all day. "Seems to me a man's got the right to sit on a public road and enjoy the morning air. And last I checked, this step was still on the right side of your property line." She wanted to argue, wanted to find some legal or logical reason to force him to leave, but the truth was, he was right. The front steps of her porch technically extended beyond her fence line onto what had once been the old wagon road. It was a technicality no one had ever bothered about when their families were friends, but now it seemed like he was using her own hospitality against her. Why? The word escaped her before she could stop it, raw and confused. "Why won't you just leave?" "Me alone." For a long moment he didn't answer. He looked out across her fields, overgrown and neglected, to where the creek wound silver through the cottonwoods. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet she had to strain to hear it. "Because someone should have stayed with me when I needed it, and they didn't. Because I know what it's like to think you have to carry everything alone, and because I've been watching you fight this battle for 3 years, and I can't stand by and watch you lose it when I could help. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story." The unexpected vulnerability in his admission caught her off guard, and for a moment, her defenses wavered. She'd heard rumors about Ethan's war service, whispered stories about battles fought and friends lost, about the way he'd come home different than he'd left. But he'd never spoken of it, not to her, not to anyone as far as she knew. "That's not your choice to make," she said, but the fight was going out of her voice. "Maybe not," he acknowledged, "but it's the choice I'm making anyway." They stood there in the morning light, two stubborn people locked in a battle of wills that neither seemed willing to lose. Julia felt the weight of his presence, the way it seemed to fill up all the empty spaces she'd grown accustomed to. For 3 years, she'd been the only voice echoing through these rooms, the only footsteps on these floors. The idea of sharing that space, even temporarily, felt dangerous in ways she couldn't articulate. But there was something else too, something she was afraid to examine too closely. Relief, the bone-deep, treacherous relief of someone who had been carrying a burden alone for so long that she'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone else willing to help shoulder the load. "The bank gave me 30 days, she found herself saying, the words escaping before she could call them back. "If I can't make the payment, they'll foreclose." He nodded, unsurprised. How much? More than I have. More than I can raise. She sat down heavily on the top step, suddenly too tired to maintain her rigid posture. I've sold everything that wasn't nailed down. The cattle are going to auction next week, but it won't be enough. Not even close. Ethan was quiet for a long time, and she could practically hear his mind working, calculating possibilities and solutions. It was one of the things that had always frustrated her about him, the way he could look at any problem and immediately start breaking it down into manageable pieces. What if there was another way? He said finally. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. Unless you know where I can find a miracle hiding in the barn, there isn't another way. Trust me. Looked. I'm serious. He turned to face her fully, and something in his expression made her stomach flutter with unwanted hope. What if you didn't have to do this alone? Ethan, I told you, not charity, he interrupted. Partnership. The word hung between them, loaded with possibilities that made her mouth go dry. She'd heard similar offers before, from neighbors and acquaintances who saw her struggling and thought they could step in and take over. But this felt different. This felt like something that might actually preserve what dignity she had left. What kind of partnership? She asked carefully. He was quiet for a moment, choosing his words with the care of a man who knew that what he said next might determine everything that came after. Marry me. The words were so simple, so quietly spoken, that for a moment she thought she'd misheard him, but when she looked at his face, she saw he was completely serious. Marry you, she repeated, her voice flat with shock. It would solve everything, he said, leaning forward slightly. Combined, our spreads would be big enough to weather any storm. The bank would have to honor a loan backed by the double cross. You'd keep your land, your independence. Nothing would change, except you wouldn't have to face it alone anymore. Julia stared at him, her mind reeling. It was so practical, so reasonable, so utterly without any of the romantic sentiment that most marriage proposals contained, which was probably why it terrified her more than any declaration of undying love could have. That's not marriage, she said finally. That's a business arrangement. Maybe, he agreed, but it's an arrangement that would save your ranch. And mine too, if I'm being honest. This valley's changing, Julia. The big cattle operations are moving in from the east, buying up every spread they can get their hands on. Alone, we're both vulnerable. Together, we'd be strong enough to hold our own. She wanted to say yes. The practical part of her brain, the part that had been keeping the books and making hard decisions for 3 years, was already calculating. The benefits, the security, the way it would solve every problem that had been keeping her awake at night. But there was another part of her, a part that remembered what marriage was supposed to be, that recoiled from the idea of entering into something so fundamental, based on nothing more than mutual convenience. I can't, she whispered. Why not? How? Could she explain it? How could she tell him that the idea of binding herself to another person, even someone as decent as Ethan Cross, felt like a betrayal of everything she'd fought to become? That she'd watched her mother's independence disappear the moment she'd said I do, watched her father make decisions that affected them all without consultation, watched love turn into a kind of beautiful prison that she'd sworn she'd never enter herself, because it wouldn't be real, she said instead. It would be as real as we made it. The quiet certainty in his voice made something twist in her chest. She looked at him, really looked at him, taking in the steady brown eyes, the patient set of his shoulders, the hands that were strong enough to rope cattle and gentle enough to coax a frightened animal to trust. He was a good man, probably the best man she'd ever known, but that only made it worse. I won't be saved, Ethan. Not by you, not by anyone. If I can't save this place myself, then maybe it wasn't meant to be saved. Pride, he said quietly. That's what this is about. your pride. The accusation stung because it was true, at least partly. But it was more complicated than that, and they both knew it. It was about identity, about the woman she'd fought to become in the ashes of her family's dreams. It was about proving, to herself as much as to the world, that she was strong enough to stand on her own. Yes, she said simply. My pride. He nodded, as if he'd expected nothing less. Then he stood, retrieving his hat from the porch rail, and for a moment she thought he was finally going to leave, finally going to give up and let her face her fate alone. Instead, he settled his hat on his head and looked down at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. I'll be back tomorrow, he said, and the day after that, and every day until you realize that accepting help doesn't make you weak, Julia. It just makes you human. Then he was walking away, his boots crunching on the gravel path, leaving her sitting alone on the porch with his proposal hanging in the air like smoke from a dying fire. She watched him mount his horse and ride away, disappearing around the bend in the road that led back toward the double cross. Only when he was completely out of sight did she allow herself to cry. The next morning came too soon, and not soon enough. Julia had spent the night alternating between pacing the kitchen floor and staring at the ceiling from her bed, Ethan's proposal echoing in her mind like a bell that wouldn't stop ringing. By the time dawn broke over the eastern hills, she'd convinced herself that he wouldn't actually return, that his declaration had been nothing more than wounded pride talking, that the light of a new day would bring him to his senses. She was wrong. He arrived just as she was carrying a bucket of water from the well, appearing around the bend in the road like some inevitable force of nature. This time, he wasn't alone. A pack mule followed behind his horse, loaded with supplies she hadn't asked for and didn't want to need. Julia set the bucket down with more force than necessary, water sloshing over the rim onto her boots. I told you not to come back. You did. Ethan dismounted and began unloading lumber from the mule's back. But I don't recall agreeing to stay away. What is all this? She gestured at the supplies, her voice tight with frustration. Your front porch is about to collapse. Figured I'd fix it before someone gets hurt. He hefted a board onto his shoulder, testing its weight. Can't have my future wife falling through rotten wood. The casual way he said it, as if her acceptance of his proposal was a foregone conclusion, made her blood simmer. I am not your future wife. I told you no. You told me you couldn't. That's different than no. He set the lumber down near the porch steps and began sorting through his tools. Thought maybe I'd give you some time to think about the difference. Julia wanted to scream. Instead, she picked up her water bucket and marched toward the house, her spine rigid with indignation. But as she climbed the front steps, she couldn't help but notice the way the third board sagged ominously under her weight, or how the railing wobbled when she brushed against it. The porch was dangerous, had been for months, but she'd been putting off the repair because lumber cost money she didn't have and labor cost more. Behind her, she heard the rhythmic sound of a saw cutting through wood. Steady, methodical, maddeningly competent. She spent the morning trying to ignore him, focusing on indoor chores that kept her away from the windows. But the sound of his work was constant, sawing, hammering, the scrape of old boards being pried away. By noon, curiosity got the better of her. She found an excuse to step outside, ostensibly to check on the chickens, and was annoyed to discover that he'd made substantial progress. The old, rotted boards had been stripped away, revealing the solid foundation underneath. New lumber lay cut and measured, ready to be installed. Ethan knelt beside the frame, his shirt sleeves rolled up to his elbows, sweat dampening the fabric across his back despite the cool autumn air. You're wasting your time, she said, more to break the silence than because she believed it. He looked up, pushing his hat back from his forehead. Am I? Because from where I'm kneeling, it looks like useful work. I can't pay you for this. Didn't ask you to. Then why are you doing it? He sat back on his heels, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. Because it needs doing, because you need help, whether you'll admit it or not, and because maybe I need to do it. The last part caught her off guard. What do you mean? For a moment, something vulnerable flickered across his features. I came back from the war with hands that were only good for destroying things. It took me a long time to remember they could build something too. The admission hung between them, raw and unexpected. Julia had heard fragments of stories about the war, about battles fought in places with names she couldn't pronounce, about boys who went away and men who came back changed. But Ethan had never spoken of it, had carried whatever he'd experienced locked away behind steady brown eyes and patient silence. The war's been over for years, she said quietly. Some wars take longer to end than others. He picked up his hammer, turning it over in his hands. Some of us are still fighting battles nobody else can see. Something in his voice made her chest tighten. She thought of the nights when she'd seen lamplight burning in his windows long past midnight, of the careful way he moved sometimes, as if sudden sounds might make him reach for weapons that weren't there. She'd assumed it was grief, the natural aftermath of loss and violence. She'd never considered that it might be something deeper, something that still held him in its grip. Is that what this is? She asked. Some kind of penance? Maybe. He met her eyes directly. Or maybe it's just a man trying to figure out how to live with himself. The honesty of it disarmed her completely. She'd been so focused on her own battles, her own survival, that she'd never considered that Ethan Cross might be fighting demons of his own. It reframed everything. His persistence, his refusal to be pushed away, his steady presence that never demanded anything in return. I should get back inside, she said, but she didn't move. Julia, her name on his lips, stopped her. I meant what I said yesterday about the proposal, but I want you to know it doesn't have to be complicated. We don't have to pretend it's something it's not. And what is it? Two people helping each other survive. He stood, brushing sawdust from his knees. Two people who care enough about this land to fight for it together instead of apart. That's all. Something shifted in his expression, a flash of something deeper that he quickly shuttered. That's enough. But as she walked back to the house, Julia couldn't shake the feeling that he was lying. Not about his offer, but about his reasons for making it. There had been something in his eyes, something that suggested his feelings ran deeper than mere partnership or mutual convenience. The thought should have made her more determined to refuse him. Instead, it made everything more complicated. She tried to stay inside after that, but the sounds of construction drew her like a moth to flame. By mid-afternoon, she found herself on the back porch, ostensibly hanging laundry, but actually watching him work through the corner of her eye. Ethan moved with the kind of easy competence that came from years of hard labor. His hands were sure, on the tools, his movements economical and precise. There was something almost meditative about the way he worked, as if the physical act of building something was its own kind of prayer. A rider appeared on the horizon, kicking up dust as he approached at a gallop. Julia recognized him even at a distance. Billy Henderson, the banker's clerk, a nervous young man who always looked like he'd rather be anywhere else when delivering bad news. Ethan must have seen him too, because he set down his tools and straightened, his body language shifting subtly into something more alert, more protective. Billy pulled up at the gate, his horse lathered with sweat. Miss Mitchell, Mr. Peterson sent me to find you. Julia's stomach dropped. The banker wouldn't send his clerk unless something had changed, and changes in her current situation were unlikely to be good news. What is it, Billy? The young man dismounted, clutching an envelope in hands that shook slightly. There's been a development, ma'am, about your loan. She walked toward him slowly, aware that Ethan had moved closer, close enough to offer support if she needed it, but not so close as to crowd her. What kind of development? Well, ma'am, it seems someone came into the bank this morning asking about your account, someone with cash money, talking about settling debts. Billy's eyes darted nervously between Julia and Ethan. Mr. Peterson sent me to tell you that if you can bring in the full amount by Friday instead of 30 days, he'll consider the matter closed. Julia's mind reeled. The full amount? But that's impossible. I told Mr. Peterson I needed time to... Yes, ma'am, but this other party, they seem to think they could help with that. Said something about partnerships and combined assets. Billy was sweating now, clearly uncomfortable with being the bearer of news he didn't fully understand. She turned to look at Ethan, who was standing very still, his face carefully neutral. But she could see the guilt in his eyes, the way he wouldn't quite meet her gaze. You went to the bank, she said, her voice deadly quiet. Julia, you went behind my back to the bank. Her voice was rising now, 3 years of frustration and fear crystallizing into pure fury. After everything I said, after I specifically told you I didn't want your help, you went anyway. It's not what you think, isn't it? She was shouting now, all pretense of control abandoned. You decided that what I wanted didn't matter, that my choices didn't matter, that you knew better than I did what was good for me. Billy Henderson backed toward his horse, clearly recognizing that he'd stumbled into something well above his pay grade. Maybe I should just leave this envelope and go. Yes, Julia snapped, not taking her eyes off Ethan. You should definitely go. The clerk dropped the envelope on the porch steps and practically vaulted onto his horse, disappearing back down the road in a cloud of dust and rattling harness. Julia and Ethan stood facing each other in the sudden silence, the half-finished porch between them like a physical manifestation of all the unfinished business that hung in the air. You had no right, she said, her voice shaking with rage. No right at all. I know. His voice was quiet, steady. But I couldn't stand by and watch you lose everything when I could prevent it. That wasn't your choice to make, wasn't it? Something flashed in his eyes, the first real anger she'd seen from him. When someone you care about is drowning, you don't ask permission to throw them a rope. I'm not drowning. I'm swimming as hard as I can, and you keep trying to drag me to shore whether I want to go or not. And what happens when you can't swim anymore? What happens when you go under and there's no one left to pull you out? The question hit too close to home, touching on fears she'd been carrying for months. But instead of being grateful, it made her furious. Then I go under. That's my choice to make. Not if I can help it. The quiet determination in his voice made her want to hit something. Instead, she turned and marched toward the house, her boots ringing on the new porch boards he'd spent the day installing. Where are you going? He called after her. To saddle my horse. I'm going to town to tell Peterson that whatever arrangement you made, I don't want any part of it. Julia, wait! But she was already inside, slamming the door behind her with enough force to rattle the windows. She could hear him calling her name, could hear his boots on the porch steps, but she didn't care. She was done being reasonable, done being grateful, done pretending that his help didn't feel like the slow erosion of everything she'd fought to become. She was halfway to the barn when he caught up with her, his hand closing gently around her wrist. Let go of me, she said, without turning around. Not until you listen. She spun to face him, jerking her arm free. Listen to what? More excuses? More justifications for treating me like a child who can't make her own decisions? Listen to the truth. His voice was rough with emotion. The truth about why I can't let you fail, because of your guilty conscience, because you think you owe some debt to the universe, because I love you. The words fell between them like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples through everything. She thought she understood about their relationship, about his motives, about the careful distance they'd maintained for 3 years. Julia stared. At him, her mouth open, her mind struggling to process what he'd just said. "What?" "I love you," he repeated, quieter this time, but no less certain. "I've loved you since we were 16 years old, and you told off Jake Morrison for pulling my sister's braids. I loved you when you married Tom Garrett instead of waiting for me to get back from the war. I loved you when you buried your parents and threw yourself into saving this ranch, like it was the only thing keeping you alive. And I love you now, even when you're so determined to push me away that you'd rather lose everything than accept help from me." She felt like she'd been punched in the chest. "Ethan, I know you don't feel the same way. I know you see me as some persistent neighbor who won't take a hint. But I can't watch you drown, Julia. I can't stand by and do nothing while everything you've worked for slips away, not when I have the power to stop it." The raw honesty in his voice, the years of carefully hidden emotion now laid bare between them, made her knees weak. She sank down onto a nearby stump, her head in her hands. "You can't just say things like that," she whispered. "Why not? Because it makes everything more complicated? Because it changes everything. Does it?" He knelt in front of her, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. "Or does it just make honest what's been true all along?" She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the boy she'd grown up with overlaid with, the man he'd become, steady, patient, impossibly kind, despite whatever darkness the war had left in him. She thought of all the times he'd appeared when she needed help most, all the small kindnesses he'd offered without expectation of return, all the ways he'd woven himself into the fabric of her life so gradually that she'd stopped noticing until his absence would have left holes. "I can't," she said finally. "Can't what?" "Can't love you back. Can't be what you need me to be." The words felt like they were being torn from her chest. "I'm too broken, Ethan, too angry, too stubborn, too afraid of losing myself in someone else's life. I'm not asking you to lose yourself. I'm asking you to find yourself with me." The gentle correction made her chest ache, but loving words didn't change practical realities, didn't erase the fears that had kept her single and self-reliant for 3 years. What if it doesn't work? What if we try this and it destroys everything between us? What if we don't try it and lose to each other anyway? She didn't have an answer for that. Instead, she stood and walked toward the barn, aware that he was following but grateful that he didn't try to stop her again. At the barn door, she paused. "I need time to think." "How much time?" She turned to look at him, standing there in the afternoon light, with sawdust in his hair and hope in his eyes, despite everything she'd put him through. "I don't know," she said honestly. "More than a day. Less than forever." He nodded, as if that answer made perfect sense. "I'll finish the porch tomorrow. After that, I'll give you space to think. And if I decide the answer is still no," something flickered across his features, but his voice remained steady, "then I'll respect that decision. But I'll still be here if you change your mind." As she watched him walk back toward the house, Julia realized that somewhere in the space of a single afternoon, everything had shifted. The battle lines she'd drawn so carefully had been redrawn, the terms of engagement fundamentally altered. She was no longer fighting just for her ranch or her independence. She was fighting for the right to choose her own future, even if that future might include the one man who'd refused to let her face it alone. The question was, what kind of future did she actually want? 3 days passed in a silence that felt different from any Julia had known before. Not the comfortable solitude she'd grown accustomed to, nor the bitter isolation that had marked her early months alone, but something charged with possibility and weighted with unspoken words. Ethan kept his promise, staying away from the ranch, but somehow managing to make his absence feel more present than his company ever had. She found evidence of his concern in small ways that made her chest tight with emotion she didn't want to name. Fresh milk appeared on her doorstep each morning, still warm from his cows. A cord of split firewood materialized beside her barn overnight, cut to the exact length her stove required. When she went to town for supplies, she discovered that her account at the general store had been mysteriously settled. The clerk mumbling something about an anonymous benefactor who'd insisted on confidentiality. Each gesture felt like a gentle pressure against the walls she'd built around herself, not demanding entry, but simply reminding her that someone cared enough to notice what she needed, even when she was too proud to ask for it. On the fourth morning, she woke to find her prize, cow, Bessie, standing in the Hendersons' pasture 2 miles down the road. The fence that should have contained her was intact, which meant the ornery animal had somehow managed to jump a barrier that should have been impossible for her to clear. As Julia trudged through the morning mist to retrieve her wayward livestock, she couldn't shake the suspicion that Bessie's escape had been less accident than divine intervention, orchestrated by someone who knew exactly how much she relied on that cow's milk. The walk back to her ranch stretched longer than usual, giving her time to think about the choice that loomed before her like a storm cloud on the horizon. Ethan's confession had changed everything and nothing, leaving her caught between the life she'd built in careful isolation and the possibility of something she'd never dared to imagine for herself. She was so lost in thought that she almost didn't notice the smoke rising from her chimney until she was halfway up her own drive. Someone was in her house. Someone had made themselves at home in her kitchen, banking her fire and probably helping themselves to her coffee. Julia's hand tightened on Bessie's lead rope, her step quickening with a mixture of irritation and something that felt suspiciously like anticipation. If Ethan Cross thought he could simply waltz back into her life before she'd made her decision, he was about to learn otherwise. But when she rounded the corner to her front porch, it wasn't Ethan's horse tied to her gate. Instead, an elegant bay mare stood waiting, her tack polished to a shine that spoke of money and careful maintenance. Julia's stomach dropped as she recognized both horse and rider. Margaret Cross, Ethan's older sister, sat on the newly repaired porch steps like she owned the place, her traveling dress immaculate despite the morning's dampness. At 32, Margaret possessed the kind of understated beauty that came from good breeding and careful attention to propriety. She also possessed opinions about everything and everyone, which she shared with the unshakable confidence of someone who'd never been told her thoughts weren't welcome. "Julia, dear." Margaret's voice carried the same warm timbre as her brother's, but where Ethan's words felt like an embrace, Margaret's felt like an assessment. "I hope you don't mind my letting myself in. I brought fresh scones and thought we might have a conversation." Julia tied Bessie to the fence post, buying herself time to school her expression into something approaching politeness. "Margaret, this is unexpected." "I'm sure it is." Margaret stood, smoothing her skirts with hands that had never known the calluses of hard labor. "I would have sent word ahead, but some conversations are better had without warning." The implied criticism stung, though Julia couldn't quite pinpoint what she was being criticized for. "I was retrieving my cow. She decided to go visiting without invitation." How inconvenient. Margaret's smile was pleasant and completely empty of warmth. "Perhaps if you had better fencing, such problems wouldn't arise." There it was, the subtle suggestion that Julia's management of her property was somehow deficient, delivered with the kind of polite concern that made it impossible to object without seeming unreasonable. It was a skill Margaret had perfected over the years, the ability to issue criticism wrapped in silk. "The fence is fine," Julia said evenly. "Bessie is just cleverer than most cattle." "I'm sure she is." Margaret gestured toward the house. "Shall we go inside? I'm sure you're eager to hear what brings me all the way out here." Julia doubted that very much, but basic courtesy demanded she offer hospitality, even to unwelcome guests bearing news she probably didn't want to hear. She led the way into her kitchen, where Margaret had indeed made herself comfortable. A pot of coffee sat warming on the stove, and a plate of golden scones rested on the table beside a jar of what looked like expensive preserves. "Please, sit." Margaret poured coffee into Julia's own cups, as if she were the hostess in someone else's home. "We have much to discuss." Julia remained standing, crossing her arms over her chest. "If this is about Ethan's proposal—" "Oh, it most certainly is." Margaret settled herself in Julia's favourite chair, stirring sugar into her coffee with delicate precision. "Though I suspect you may not understand the full implications of what you're considering." "I understand them perfectly well. Do you?" Margaret's eyebrows rose in elegant skepticism, "because, from where I sit, it appears you're contemplating entering into a marriage that could destroy my brother's future." The blunt accusation hit Julia like a slap. "Destroy his future? How? My dear girl, surely you must realize that Ethan's feelings for you are complicated by guilt and circumstance. He sees you struggling and feels compelled to help, as any decent man would. But marriage born of pity rarely leads to happiness." Julia felt heat rise in her cheeks. "He told me he loves me. I'm sure he believes he does." Margaret's tone suggested that Ethan's beliefs were charming, but ultimately irrelevant. "My brother has always been too tender-hearted for his own good. He came back from the war with a powerful need to fix things, to save people. You've simply become his latest project." Each word landed like a physical blow, not because Julia believed them entirely, but because they echoed doubts she'd been carrying since Ethan's confession. How could she be sure his feelings were real when her circumstances made it so easy to confuse love with obligation? "That's quite an accusation," Julia managed. "It's an observation based on years of watching my brother sacrifice his own interests for others." Margaret leaned forward, her expression softening slightly. "Ethan needs a wife who can match his social position, someone who can help him build the kind of life our family expects. Not someone who will drag him down into poverty and scandal. I never asked him to sacrifice anything for me." "Of course you didn't. That's precisely the problem." Margaret stood, moving to the window that overlooked the neglected fields. "You're so determined to prove your independence that you've blinded yourself to the damage your pride is causing." "My pride?" "Your stubborn refusal to accept help when it's offered. Your insistence on fighting battles you cannot win. Your willingness to let everything collapse around you rather than admit you need assistance." Margaret turned back to face her, and there was something almost pitying in her expression. "It's admirable in its way, but it's also selfish." Julia felt as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet. "Selfish? You're so focused on maintaining your independence that you haven't considered what your choices cost the people who care about you. Do you think it's easy for Ethan to watch you struggle? Do you think it doesn't tear at him, knowing he could solve your problems with a few words?" "To the banker?" The question struck home with uncomfortable accuracy. Julia had been so focused on her own battles that she'd never fully considered the toll her situation might be taking on others. But that didn't make Margaret's criticism any less infuriating. "So, what would you have me do?" Julia asked. "Marry your brother out of gratitude? Accept charity disguised as partnership? I would have you make the choice that serves everyone's best interests, not just your own wounded pride." Margaret's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Release him from whatever obligation he feels toward you. Let him find happiness with someone who can actually make him happy." "And if I believe I could make him happy?" Margaret's laugh was light and utterly dismissive. "Oh, my dear, look around you. Look at this house, these fields, your circumstances. Do you honestly believe you have anything to offer a man like Ethan beyond the satisfaction of playing rescuer?" The cruelty of it took Julia's breath away. Not because it was entirely untrue, but because it voiced every insecurity she'd been fighting since Ethan's proposal. What did she have to offer beyond debt and stubbornness and fields gone fallow? What could she give him that would be worth the sacrifice Margaret claimed he was making? "I think you should leave," Julia said quietly. "I think you should consider what I've said." Margaret gathered her gloves and reticule with unhurried grace. "Ethan deserves better than a marriage born of desperation. And if you truly care for him, you'll give him the chance to find it." She paused at the door, her hand on the latch. "There's going to be a social event at the Patterson Ranch this Saturday. The Whitmore family will be there. They have a daughter well-educated with a substantial dowry. Ethan has been invited, though he hasn't yet responded." The implication hung in the air like smoke. "I see. I hope you do." Margaret's smile was all sharp edges hidden beneath careful politeness. "I hope you see clearly enough to make the right choice." After Margaret left, Julia sat alone in her kitchen, staring at the untouched scones and feeling as if she'd been taken apart and reassembled slightly wrong. Every doubt she'd managed to push aside came flooding back with renewed force, accompanied by new questions that felt impossible to answer. Was Margaret right? Was Ethan's devotion really just guilt disguised as love? Was she being selfish by considering his proposal when accepting it might trap him in a life he'd grow to resent? She tried to imagine him at the Patterson social, dancing with the well-dowered Miss Whitmore, surrounded by people who shared his background and expectations, people who could offer him the kind of future Margaret thought he deserved. The image made her stomach clench with something that felt suspiciously like jealousy, which only made everything worse. If she truly loved Ethan, and she was beginning to suspect she did, despite her best efforts to remain detached, didn't that mean she should want what was best for him, even if it meant stepping aside? She was still wrestling with these thoughts when she heard hoofbeats on the road. Her heart jumped, hoping despite everything that it might be Ethan, returning early from his self-imposed exile. Instead, she found herself facing Billy Henderson again, though this time he looked even more nervous than usual. "Miss Mitchell," he called before he'd even dismounted. "Mr. Peterson needs to see you right away. Says it's urgent." Julia's blood turned to ice. "What kind of urgent?" "The kind that can't wait until tomorrow, ma'am. He sent me to fetch you personal-like." The ride to town passed in a blur of autumn landscape and growing dread. Whatever news Peterson had for her, it wasn't good. Bankers didn't summon people for pleasant conversations, especially not people who were already behind on their payments. She found Peterson waiting in his office, his usually jovial demeanor, replaced by something that looked suspiciously like embarrassment. He gestured for her to sit, then spent several moments shuffling papers on his desk before finally meeting her eyes. "Miss Mitchell, I'm afraid there's been a complication with your loan situation." Julia's hands clenched in her lap. "What kind of complication?" "Well, it seems the gentleman who came in earlier this week, Mr. Cross, his offer to guarantee your debt has been reconsidered." The words hit her like a physical blow. "Reconsidered?" "He came in this morning and withdrew his offer. Said there had been a change in circumstances." Peterson's discomfort was obvious. "I'm afraid that means we're back to the original terms. Payment in full by the end of the month, or foreclosure proceedings will begin." Julia sat in stunned silence, her mind struggling to process what she was hearing. Ethan had withdrawn his offer after everything he'd said about not giving up, about fighting for her ranch together. He'd changed his mind. "Did he say why?" she managed. "No, ma'am. Just that he'd reconsidered the wisdom of the arrangement." Peterson leaned forward, his expression sympathetic but businesslike. "I have to ask, Miss Mitchell, do you have any other options, any other way to raise the funds?" She shook her head mutely, not trusting her voice. There were no other options. There never had been. Ethan's offer had been her only hope, and now that was gone. "I'm sorry," Peterson said, and he sounded like he meant it. I truly am. Your father was a good man, and I hate to see the ranch leave the family. But business is business. Julia nodded mechanically and somehow found her way out of the bank and back onto her horse. The ride home passed in a haze of shock and growing anger. By the time she reached her gate, the shock had crystallized into something harder and more familiar: betrayal. She'd been right all along. Ethan's persistence, his declarations of love, his refusal to accept her rejections, all of it had been nothing more than elaborate manipulation. And the moment his sister had reminded him of his duty to his family's expectations, he'd abandoned her as quickly as every other man in her life. The newly repaired porch seemed to mock her as she climbed the steps. All that work, all those careful repairs, and for what? So she could sit in comfort while she lost everything anyway? She was still sitting there an hour later when she heard familiar hoofbeats on the road. This time it was Ethan, riding toward her house with the same steady determination that had marked every other visit. But this time Julia was ready for him. This time she was going to end this charade once and for all. Ethan dismounted slowly, his movements careful in the way of a man approaching a spooked horse. Even from a distance, Julia could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes searched her face for some clue to her mood. He'd always been able to read her too well, a skill that had once comforted her and now felt like an invasion. Julia. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, making no move to climb them. Billy Henderson rode past me on the road. He looked like he'd seen a ghost. She stood, her hands steady despite the storm raging in her chest. That's funny. I feel like I've seen one too. Something in her tone made him go very still. What happened? Oh, I think you know exactly what happened. She descended the steps, slowly, each footfall deliberate on the boards he'd so carefully repaired. The question is whether you're going to stand there and pretend you don't. Ethan's brow furrowed, genuine confusion flickering across his features. I have no idea what you're talking about, don't you? She stopped just out of arm's reach, close enough to see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, close enough to catch the scent of leather and wood smoke that always clung to his clothes. Peterson didn't send for you today? You didn't visit the bank this morning? Understanding dawned in his expression, followed immediately by something that looked like resignation. Ah. The casual response ignited something volatile in her chest. That's all you have to say? Ah? Julia, let me explain. Explain what? How did you make me believe you meant what you said about not giving up? How do you convince me to trust you just long enough to pull the rug out from under me? Her voice was rising, 3 years of controlled emotion finally breaking free. Or maybe you'd like to explain how your sister managed to change your mind so quickly. His head snapped up, eyes sharpening. Margaret was here this morning, with scones and sisterly advice about what a poor match I'd make for a man of your standing. Julia laughed, but there was no humor in it. She painted quite a picture of my shortcomings, stubborn, prideful, selfish. A woman who would drag you down into poverty and scandal. Julia, whatever she said, was she wrong? The question came out sharper than she'd intended, but she pressed on. Am I not stubborn, pride, determined to fight battles I can't win? That's not, because it certainly seemed to convince you. She turned away from him, unable to bear the look on his face. One conversation with your sister, and suddenly you're reconsidering the wisdom of tying yourself to a failing ranch and a woman who can't even keep her cattle penned. It wasn't like that. Then what was it like? She spun back to face him, her control finally snapping completely. Because from where I stand, it looks exactly like every other time someone decided I wasn't worth the trouble. First my father's business partners after he died, then the neighbors who stopped calling when it became clear I wasn't going to quietly sell out and move to town. Now you. I am nothing like those people. Aren't you? Because you sure disappeared. Fast enough when reality set in. Ethan stepped forward, his own composure beginning to crack. You want to know about reality? The reality is that I went to the bank this morning to find out exactly what you owed, down to the last cent. I wanted to know what we were dealing with so I could figure out the best way to help without making you feel like charity case. Julia felt a flicker of uncertainty, but pushed it aside. And I discovered that someone else had already been there, someone who'd offered to buy your debt outright, not guarantee it. Buy it, Julia. Lock, stock, and barrel. The words hit her, like cold water. What? Hiram Blackwood. He wants your land for his cattle operation, and he's willing to pay Peterson more than the loan is worth to get it. Ethan's voice was tight with anger. Peterson was practically drooling at the prospect. More money than he'd see from your loan. Impayments, and he gets to foreclose on a property that'll be sold at auction to the highest bidder. Julia's mind reeled. Blackwood was one of the big operators Margaret had mentioned, the kind of man who saw small ranches like hers as obstacles to be removed rather than neighbors to be respected. But Peterson said what he thought you wanted to hear. But when I pressed him, the truth came out. Blackwood made his offer yesterday, right after Margaret paid him a visit. The pieces began falling into place with sickening clarity. Margaret hadn't just come to convince Julia to release Ethan from his perceived obligation. She'd been laying groundwork for something much more calculated. Your sister orchestrated this, Julia said quietly. It looks that way. Ethan's voice was rough with something that might have been shame. She's always been protective of what she sees as the family's interests, but I never thought she'd go this far. So you withdrew your offer to protect me from your sister's machinations. I withdrew my offer because it was useless. Blackwood's bid makes my guarantee irrelevant. Peterson's going to recommend the sale to his board, whether you can make the payments or not. Ethan raked a hand through his hair, frustration evident in every line of his body. I came here to tell you what I'd learned, to figure out what our options are now. Julia sank back onto the porch steps, the fight draining out of her as the full scope of the situation became clear. It wasn't just about her loan anymore. It was about forces much larger than her individual struggle, about people with enough money and influence to reshape the entire valley according to their vision. There are no options, she said dully. If Blackwood wants this land, he'll get it. Men like him always do. Not always. Ethan sat beside her, careful to leave space. Between them, there might be another way. What way? He was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the fields that had once been green with her father's crops and now lay dormant under the autumn sky. When he spoke, his voice was measured, careful. What if we beat him at his own game? I don't understand marriage. He turned to look at her, and she was surprised to see not resignation in his eyes, but determination. Not the arrangement I proposed before, but a real partnership. Combined, our properties would be too large for Blackwood to acquire piecemeal. He'd have to deal with us as equals instead of picking us off one by one. Julia stared at him. You still want to marry me after everything that's happened today? Especially after everything that's happened today. His voice grew stronger, more certain. Because now I know this isn't just about saving your ranch. It's about saving this entire valley from being carved up by men who see land as nothing more than profit margins. That's not a reason to get married, isn't it? People have married for worse reasons. He shifted slightly, turning to face her, more fully. But if you need a better reason, I'll give you one. I love you, Julia. Not because you need saving. Not because I feel guilty about your circumstances, but because you're the strongest, most determined woman I've ever known. Because you'd rather lose everything than compromise your principles. Because you see this land the same way I do, as something worth fighting for. The words settled over her like a warm blanket, soothing hurts she hadn't realized she was carrying. But doubt remained, a cold voice in the back of her mind that sounded suspiciously like Margaret Cross. "What about your family's expectations? Your sister made it very clear that I'm not suitable for a man of your position. My sister doesn't get to decide who I marry." There was steel in his voice now, an edge she'd never heard before. "And if my family can't accept the woman I choose, then maybe it's time I stopped caring about their approval." "Ethan, no, listen to me." He reached for her hands, covering them with his own. "I spent 4 years fighting other people's wars, following other people's orders, being who other people needed me to be. I came home thinking I owed the world something, that I had to earn the right to be happy, but I was wrong." His thumb traced across her knuckles, a gentle touch that sent warmth shooting up her arm. "Happiness isn't something you earn. It's something you choose. And I'm choosing you, Julia. Not because I think you need me, but because I know I need you." Julia felt something crack open in her chest, a place she'd kept carefully walled off for 3 years. "I don't know how to do this," she whispered. "I don't know how to be someone's wife without losing myself in the process. Then we'll figure it out together. We'll make our own rules, build our own kind of marriage." His smile was soft, tentative. "We'll be partners in every sense of the word." Before she could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats made them both turn. 3 riders were coming up the road at a steady pace, and even at a distance Julia could see that they weren't neighbors, dropping by for a social call. The lead rider sat his horse, with the kind of easy authority that spoke of money and power, while the 2 men flanking him had the hard-eyed look of hired muscle. "Blackwood," Ethan said quietly, his body tensing beside her. Julia stood, squaring her shoulders as the riders approached. She might be about to lose everything, but she'd face it standing up. Hiram Blackwood was a man who wore his wealth like armor, from his perfectly tailored coat to the gold watch chain that caught the afternoon light. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 40, with the kind of pale, soft features that spoke of a life spent indoors, counting money rather than outdoors earning it. He dismounted at her gate with the casual confidence of someone who'd never been told he wasn't welcome anywhere. "Miss Mitchell, Mr. Cross." His voice carried a slight accent that suggested Eastern education and careful elocution. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion." "Actually, I do," Julia said evenly. "This is private property. For now." Blackwood's smile was all teeth and no warmth, though I understand that may be changing soon. "What do you want, Blackwood?" Ethan's voice was calm, but Julia could feel the tension radiating from him. "To make a generous offer to Miss Mitchell, one that could save her considerable embarrassment." Blackwood reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document. "I'm prepared to purchase this property for significantly more than its current market value, enough to pay off all debts and leave Miss Mitchell with a tidy sum to start fresh somewhere more, suitable to her circumstances." Julia didn't take the offered paper. "And if I'm not interested in starting fresh? Then you'll lose it anyway, but for much less money and with considerably more public humiliation." The false politeness dropped from his voice like a mask. "Foreclosure proceedings are messy things, Miss Mitchell. Newspaper notices, public auctions, neighbors watching as everything you own is carted away by strangers. Much more dignified to sell now, while you still have some control over the process." "The lady said she wasn't interested," Ethan said quietly. Blackwood's attention shifted to him, and something predatory flickered in his pale eyes. "Ah, yes, Mr. Cross. I've heard about your involvement in Miss Mitchell's affairs." "Touching, really. But I should point out that your own ranch would be much more valuable as part of a larger operation. I'd be willing to make you a similar offer. Not interested. Think carefully before you answer. I have it on good authority that your current financial situation is more precarious than it appears. All those improvements you've been making, the expansion plans, they've stretched your resources rather thin, haven't they? Julia felt Ethan go rigid beside her. There was something in Blackwood's tone that suggested he knew more about Ethan's finances than he should. "What are you implying?" Ethan asked. "I'm not implying anything. I'm stating facts." Blackwood's smile returned, cold and satisfied. "Your credit with the Territorial Bank is extended to its limit. Your cattle contracts for next year depend on maintaining your current herd size, and your current herd size depends on having enough winter feed, which depends on a hay crop that's been delayed by this early freeze we had last month." Each statement landed like a blow, and Julia could see from Ethan's expression that they were accurate. He'd been so focused on helping her that she'd never considered he might be struggling with problems of his own. One bad winter, one delayed. A shipment, one sick herd, and you'll be in the same position as Miss Mitchell here, Blackwood continued. "Wouldn't it be wiser to sell now, while you can still negotiate from a position of strength?" "Get off my property," Julia said, her voice deadly quiet. "Miss Mitchell, I said get off my property, now." Blackwood studied her face for a moment, then shrugged as if her defiance was merely an amusing inconvenience. "Very well, but my offer stands for 48 hours. After that, market forces will take their natural course." He remounted his horse, gathering his reins with the casual ease of someone who'd gotten exactly what he'd come for, the satisfaction of demonstrating just how precarious their situation really was. "Oh, and Miss Mitchell." He paused at the gate, his smile sharp as broken glass. "You might want to ask Mr. Cross about his recent visit to see Margaret. Quite illuminating conversation from what I understand." Then he was gone, leaving Julia and Ethan alone with the implications of everything that had been said and unsaid. Julia turned to look at Ethan, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. Not as the steady, unshakable man she'd always thought him to be, but as someone fighting his own battles, facing his own fears, carrying his own burdens. "You're in trouble too," she said quietly. He didn't deny it. "Some." "How much trouble?" "Enough that Blackwood's not entirely wrong about my situation." Ethan's voice was steady, but she could see the cost of the admission in the tightness around his eyes. "I've been borrowing against future contracts to make improvements, counting on cattle prices staying stable. If they drop, or if I lose even a portion of my herd, you could lose everything." Yes. They stood there in the growing dusk. Two people who'd been so focused on their individual struggles that they'd lost sight of the larger forces working against them both. Julia felt something shift inside her, a fundamental reordering of how she saw their situation. "Margaret knew," she said suddenly, "about your financial troubles. That's why she was so determined to break us apart. She knew that marrying me wouldn't just drag you down, it would destroy you completely." "Maybe, but that's still my choice to make." Ethan stepped closer, his voice gentle but firm. "And I'm still making it, with my eyes wide open this time." Julia looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not the man who'd been trying to rescue her, but a partner who understood exactly what they were both facing, someone who was willing to stand with her not because he had something to give, but because together they might be stronger than they were apart. 48 hours, she said. 48 hours, he agreed. If we're going to do this, if we're really going to fight Blackwood and your sister and everyone else who thinks they know what's best for us, then we need to be absolutely certain. No doubts, no reservations, no looking back. No looking back, he echoed. And for the first time since this whole ordeal began, Julia found herself actually believing that they might have a chance. Dawn came grey and hesitant, as if the sun itself was uncertain about what the new day might bring. Julia had spent the night alternating between fitful sleep and long stretches of staring at the ceiling, her mind churning over everything that had happened in the space of a single afternoon. 46 hours remained on Blackwood's ultimatum, and each passing minute felt like sand slipping through an hourglass she couldn't turn over. She found Ethan waiting on her porch when she stepped outside to collect eggs from the henhouse. He sat on the top step with 2 steaming cups of coffee, his hair damp from what looked like a hasty wash at the well. Dark circles under his eyes suggested he'd slept about as well as she had. "Thought you might need this," he said, offering her one of the cups. She accepted it gratefully, inhaling the rich aroma before taking her first sip. It was perfect, strong enough to wake the dead, but smooth enough not to bite. Somehow he'd remembered exactly how she liked it, a small detail that felt more intimate than any grand gesture. "How long have you been here?" she asked. "Since before sunrise. Wanted to be sure Blackwood didn't send any of his men around to apply pressure while you were alone." Ethan's voice was calm, but she could see the tension in the set of his shoulders. "Did some thinking while I waited." "About what?" "About everything we're up against, about what it would actually take to win this fight." He set his cup down and turned to face her fully. "And about something Blackwood said yesterday that's been eating at me." Julia felt her stomach tighten. "What?" "He mentioned that I'd visited Margaret. Made it sound like we'd had some kind of conversation about you, about us." Ethan's eyes met hers directly. "I haven't spoken to my sister in 2 weeks, Julia, not since she made some unpleasant comments about your situation at Sunday dinner." The admission sent a chill down her spine. "Then how did he know?" "That's what I've been trying to figure out. Blackwood's not the kind of man who deals in rumors or speculation. If he said I'd visited Margaret, he had a reason for saying it." Ethan stood, beginning to pace the length of the porch. "Which means either he's trying to drive a wedge between us with lies, or someone told him something that made him think it was true." Julia set her own cup down, her mind racing through the implications. "Margaret came here yesterday morning before I went to town. She could have told Blackwood that she'd spoken to me, let him assume that she'd gotten to me through you." Ethan stopped pacing, his expression darkening. "Son of a bitch, he's been playing us against each other from the beginning." The pieces began falling into place with sickening clarity. Margaret's perfectly timed visit with her carefully crafted doubts. Blackwood's offer to Peterson coming immediately after. The way he'd arrived at Julia's ranch just as she and Ethan were having their confrontation, as if he'd known exactly when to strike for maximum impact. "He orchestrated all of it," Julia said quietly. "Your sister's visit, the bank situation, even our fight yesterday. He wanted us divided when he made his move." "Looks that way." Ethan's voice was tight with anger. "The question is, what are we going to do about it?" Before Julia could answer, the sound of approaching hoofbeats made them both turn. But this time, it wasn't Blackwood or his hired men. Instead, a familiar figure rounded the bend in the road, riding hard enough to kick up a substantial cloud of dust. Doc Harrison pulled up at the gate, his usually neat appearance disheveled, and his face grim with whatever news had brought him out so early. At 65, the doctor had been serving the valley for more than 30 years, and Julia had never seen him look quite so shaken. "Doc?" Ethan was already moving toward the gate. "What's wrong?" "Need to speak with both of you." "Now." Harrison dismounted stiffly, his arthritic joints protesting the hard ride. "It's about what happened in town last night." Julia felt ice form in her stomach. "What happened?" "Fire at the bank. Started around midnight. Burned for 3 hours before we could get it under control." Harrison's voice was carefully controlled, but she could hear the underlying tension. "Peterson's in bad shape. Smoke inhalation. But that's not the worst of it. Doc, just tell us." Ethan said quietly. All the loan documents were destroyed. Every mortgage, every contract, every piece of paper that proved who owed what to whom. Harrison looked between them, his expression grave. In one night, every debt in this valley just vanished into smoke. The silence that followed was so complete that Julia could hear her own heartbeat. She looked at Ethan, seeing her own shock reflected in his expression. "How?" she managed. "That's what the sheriff's trying to figure out. But between you and me, fires don't usually start themselves in locked buildings with no one around." Harrison pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and wiped his brow. "Especially not fires that burn hot enough to destroy everything, but leave the safe untouched." The safe wasn't damaged, not so much as scorched, but it was empty when they opened it this morning. Every document, every record gone. Harrison's eyes fixed on Julia, including the papers Blackwood brought Peterson yesterday. Julia felt the world shift around her, as if she'd been standing on solid ground, only to discover it was quicksand. "What does this mean?" "Means, legally speaking, you don't owe the bank anything. Can't collect on a debt you can't prove exists." Harrison managed a tired smile. "Also means Blackwood can't buy what isn't for sale. But surely there are copies somewhere." "Bank records are kept in one place, Miss Mitchell. Peterson always said it was safer that way. All the important papers locked up together." Harrison shrugged. Turns out he was wrong. Ethan had gone very still, his expression thoughtful. "Doc, did anyone see anything unusual last night? Anyone who might have been near the bank before the fire started?" "Funny you should ask." Harrison's tone suggested he found nothing funny about it at all. Young Billy Henderson was walking home from the saloon around 11:30. Says he saw someone leaving the bank area, but it was too dark to make out who. Someone with keys? Had to be. No signs of forced entry, and the lock wasn't damaged. Harrison looked between them again. Makes a man wonder if someone wanted those records destroyed badly enough to risk everything. The implications hung in the air like smoke from the fire that had changed everything. Julia's mind raced through possibilities, each one more troubling than the last. "Peterson's going to survive?" Ethan asked. "Should recover fully, though it'll take time. But he's not talking much right now, and when he does—" Harrison shook his head. "Man's in shock, keeps saying he should have seen it coming, should have protected the records better." "What happens now?" Julia asked. "Now?" "Now everyone who had a loan with that bank is essentially starting over. No debt, but also no legal claim to their property if they'd been using it as collateral." Harrison remounted his horse with obvious effort. "There will be interesting times in this valley, I suspect." After the doctor left, Julia and Ethan stood in stunned silence, trying to process the magnitude of what they'd just learned. In the space of a few hours, their entire situation had changed completely. "Someone burned down the bank," Julia said finally. "Looks that way. Someone who knew about Blackwood's plan, who knew which documents needed to disappear. That's my thinking too." Ethan's voice was carefully neutral. "The question is who?" Julia turned to look at him, studying his profile as he stared out at the road Doc Harrison had taken back to town. There was something in his expression, a careful blankness that suggested he was working very hard not to think about something. "Ethan," she said quietly, "where were you last night?" He turned to meet her gaze, and she saw the answer in his eyes before he spoke. "Where do you think I was?" The simple question hit her like a physical blow. "You didn't." "Didn't I?" "Ethan, tell me you didn't burn down the bank." For a long moment he didn't respond. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet she had to strain to hear it. "What would you do if someone threatened to take everything from the person you loved? What would you do if you had the power to stop it?" "I would find a legal way." There was no legal way. Blackwood had all the cards, all the money, all the influence. In 46 hours you would have lost this ranch, and there was nothing either of us could do to stop it. His voice grew stronger, more certain. "Nothing legal anyway." Julia stared at him, her mind struggling to reconcile the gentle, patient man she thought she knew with someone capable of such calculated destruction. "You could have been killed. Peterson nearly was. I made sure the building was empty before I did anything, and I left the back door unlocked so Peterson could get out if he came back unexpectedly." Ethan's jaw was set with the kind of determination she'd seen when he'd refused to leave her property. "I wouldn't have hurt an innocent person, Julia, but I wasn't going to stand by and watch Blackwood steal this valley piece by piece. What if they find out? What if someone saw you, or they won't find out I was careful?" He stepped closer, his voice urgent. "And even if they did, it would be worth it. Your ranch is safe now. Your land, your future. It's all safe." Julia felt something crack inside her chest. Not the sharp break of betrayal, but something deeper and more complex. He'd risked everything for her, his reputation, his freedom, possibly his life. He'd committed a crime that could see him hanged, all to save a ranch she'd been ready to lose. "Why?" she whispered. "Because I meant what I said. I'm not going anywhere, Julia, not ever." He reached for her hands, his fingers warm despite the morning chill. "I don't care what it costs, what I have to do, what anyone thinks. I'm not letting them take you from me." The raw emotion in his voice, the absolute certainty of his commitment, hit her like a wave. This wasn't the careful proposal of a man looking for a business arrangement. This was something much more dangerous, much more real. "You're insane," she said, but there was no anger in it. "Probably." His smile was soft, tentative. "Is that a problem?" Julia looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not the steady, predictable neighbor she'd always thought him to be, but someone capable of extraordinary acts of devotion. Someone who would burn down buildings to protect what he loved. It should have terrified her. Instead, it made her feel safer than she had in years. "What happens when Blackwood finds out?" she asked. "He'll suspect, but he won't be able to prove anything. And without those loan documents, his whole plan falls apart. He can't buy debt that doesn't legally exist anymore. He won't give up." "No, probably not. But now we have time to prepare. Time to figure out how to fight him on our own." "Terms!" Ethan's grip on her hands tightened slightly. "Together." The word hung between them, loaded with possibility and promise. Julia felt the last of her defenses crumble, not from external pressure, but from something much more powerful. The recognition that she didn't want to fight alone anymore. "Together," she repeated. "Is that a yes?" She thought about everything that had brought them to this moment. The years of struggle, the pride that had nearly cost her everything, the fear that had kept her isolated and alone. Then she thought about the man standing before her, who'd literally burned bridges to build a future with her. "Ask me again," she said. Ethan's smile was radiant as he dropped to one knee right there on her front porch, still holding her hands in his. "Julia Mitchell, will you marry me? Not because you need saving, not because I feel guilty, but because I love you, and I want to spend whatever time I have left on this earth building something beautiful with you." "Yes," she said, the word coming out stronger and more certain than she'd expected. "Yes, I'll marry you." He stood and kissed her then, soft and sweet and full of promise. And for the first time in 3 years, Julia felt like she was truly home. But even as she melted into his embrace, a part of her mind was already working ahead, thinking about Blackwood and Margaret and all the other forces that would try to tear them apart. The bank fire had bought them time, but it hadn't ended the war. That would take something else entirely. The news of their engagement spread through Clearwater Valley faster than wildfire, carried by tongues that wagged with equal parts excitement and scandal. By the time Julia and Ethan made their first public appearance together at the general store 3 days after the bank fire, the entire town seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see how the drama would unfold. Julia had expected whispers and stares. What she hadn't expected was the careful division that seemed to have split the community down the middle. Some neighbors offered genuine congratulations, their smiles warm with the kind of approval that came from seeing two good people find happiness together. Others maintained a polite distance, their expressions carefully neutral in a way that suggested they were reserving judgment until they saw which way the wind blew. And then there were those who made no effort to hide their disapproval. "Well, well," came a familiar voice from behind the bolts of fabric. "If it isn't the happy couple." Margaret Cross emerged from the shadows between the shelves like some elegant predator, her traveling dress immaculate despite the dust that seemed to coat everything else in the store. Her smile was sharp enough to cut glass, and her eyes held the kind of cold fury that Julia had learned to recognize as dangerous. "Margaret." Ethan's voice was carefully controlled, but Julia could feel the tension radiating from him. "I didn't expect to see you in town today." "I'm sure you didn't." Margaret's gaze moved between them, taking in their joined hands, with the kind of distaste most people reserved for something unpleasant they'd found on their shoe. "Though I suppose I shouldn't be surprised. After all, timing has always been so important to you, hasn't it, dear brother?" There was something in her tone that made Julia's skin crawl, a suggestion of hidden meaning that felt like a trap waiting to be sprung. "What's that supposed to mean?" Ethan asked. "Oh, nothing. Just that your proposal came at such a fortuitous moment, right after poor Mr. Peterson's unfortunate accident with the bank." Margaret's smile widened, showing too many teeth. "Amazing how these things work out, isn't it? Almost as if someone knew exactly when to make their move." Julia felt ice form in her stomach. Margaret knew. Somehow, impossibly, she knew about the fire. "I don't know what you're implying," Ethan started. "I'm not implying anything, darling. I'm simply observing that you've always been so resourceful when it comes to solving problems." Margaret stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow felt more menacing than a shout. "Remember when we were children, and you solved the problem of Tommy Carson bullying our little sister? Such an unfortunate accident. The way he fell into that creek and nearly drowned. That was different, was it? Because from where I stand, it looks like the same pattern. Someone threatens something you care about, and suddenly they find themselves facing unexpected difficulties." Margaret's eyes glittered with malicious satisfaction. "The only difference is the scale of the consequences." Julia watched the exchange with growing horror, seeing pieces of a puzzle she'd never known existed clicking into place. The careful way Ethan had always spoken about his past, the shadows that sometimes crossed his face when he thought no one was looking, the quiet competence with which he'd approached the problem of the bank fire. "What do you want, Margaret?" Julia asked, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice. "Want? Oh, my dear, I don't want anything. I'm simply here to offer my congratulations on your engagement, and perhaps to share some sisterly advice about the man you're planning to marry." Margaret's attention fixed on Julia with laser focus. "Did you know, for instance, that during the war, Ethan earned quite a reputation for his ability to eliminate obstacles? Of course they called it reconnaissance then, but the principle remains the same." Julia felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. "I don't believe you. Don't you? Then perhaps you'd like to ask him about Fort Donelson, about the Confederate supply depot that mysteriously caught fire the night before a major battle, or about the bridge that collapsed just as enemy reinforcements were crossing it." Margaret's voice carried the satisfied tone of someone playing a winning hand. Such a remarkable series of coincidences, all traced back to one very talented young scout. Julia turned to look at Ethan, searching his face for some sign that Margaret was lying, that this was just another attempt to drive a wedge between them. Instead, she saw confirmation in the tightness around his eyes, the way his jaw had set in the stubborn line she'd come to know so well. "It was war," he said quietly. "People do what they have to do to survive." "Oh, I'm not judging, dear brother. Quite the opposite, actually. I'm impressed by your consistency. Margaret gathered her reticule and gloves with the unhurried grace of someone who'd accomplished exactly what she'd set out to do. After all, it takes a special kind of man to burn down a bank to get what he wants. Almost romantic, really. The words hung in the air like smoke, and Julia felt every eye in the store turned toward them. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, and the only sound was the tick of the clock on the wall and the hammering of her own heartbeat. "That's quite an accusation," Julia said carefully. "Is it an accusation? I thought it was a compliment." Margaret's smile was all innocence and venom. After all, what woman wouldn't want a man willing to risk everything for her? Though I do hope the two of you have discussed what happens when his past catches up with him. Prison is so hard on a marriage, I'm told. She swept toward the door, pausing just long enough to deliver one final blow. "Oh, and Ethan, Mr. Blackwood is very interested in meeting with you. Something about shared interests and mutual understanding. I took the liberty of telling him you'd be available this afternoon." Then she was gone, leaving Julia and Ethan standing in the sudden silence of a store full of people pretending they hadn't heard every word. "We should go," Ethan said quietly. Julia nodded, not trusting her voice. They completed their purchases in tense silence, each transaction conducted under the watchful eyes of neighbors who were already mentally composing the stories they'd tell their families at dinner. It wasn't until they were safely in Ethan's wagon, rattling down the dusty road toward home, that Julia finally found her voice. "Is it true?" Ethan's hands tightened on the reins, but he didn't look at her. "Which part?" "All of it. The war, the fires, the bridges." She paused, then forced herself to ask the question that was eating at her. "Did you really burn down buildings during the war?" For a long moment, the only sound was the creak of the wagon wheels and the soft thud of the horses' hooves on packed earth. When Ethan finally spoke, his voice was so quiet she had to strain to hear it. Margaret always did have a talent for making the truth sound ugly. He glanced at her briefly, then returned his attention to the road. "But yes, it's true. I was a scout, and sometimes my job involved removing obstacles." "Removing obstacles," Julia repeated. "That's one way to put it. What would you prefer I call it? Because I can give you a dozen different words, but they all mean the same thing in the end." There was pain in his voice now, old wounds that had never fully healed. "I did what I was ordered to do, Julia. I helped win a war that needed winning, and I tried not to think too hard about the details. And after the war, I came home and tried to forget. Tried to build something instead of destroying it. Tried to be the kind of man who deserved to live when so many others didn't." His voice cracked slightly. "But some skills, once you learn them, you never really lose." Julia stared at his profile, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. Not the steady, gentle neighbor she'd thought she knew, but someone shaped by violence and loss into something harder and more dangerous than she'd ever imagined. "The bank fire," she said. "It wasn't your first, was it?" "No." The admission came out flat, emotionless. "It wasn't. How many others? Does it matter? It matters to me." Ethan brought the wagon to a stop at the side of the road, finally turning to face her fully. His eyes held a kind of weary resignation that made her chest ache. "3," he said. "3 buildings that stood between me and something I needed to protect. The first was a Confederate munitions depot. The second was a supply warehouse that was feeding troops who were killing my friends. The third was Peterson's Bank. And the bridge Margaret mentioned. One bridge, 12 enemy soldiers died when it collapsed." His voice was steady, but she could see the cost of the admission in his face. "I tell myself they would have killed twice that many of our boys if I'd let them cross, but they're still dead because of choices I made." Julia felt as if she were falling, all her assumptions about the man she'd agreed to marry crumbling around her. This wasn't the gentle protector she'd imagined, but someone capable of calculated violence when he deemed it necessary. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked. "Would it have changed anything? Would knowing about my past have made you trust me more or less?" She wanted to say it wouldn't have mattered, that she would have understood, but the words stuck in her throat. Because the truth was, it did matter. It changed everything about how she saw him, how she understood his capabilities, how she interpreted his patience and gentleness. "I don't know," she said honestly. "That's why I didn't tell you, because I was afraid you'd look at me the way you're looking at me now." "How am I looking at you? Like you're wondering if you really know me at all." The accuracy of the observation hit her like a slap. Because that was exactly what she was thinking, what she'd been thinking since Margaret's revelations had turned. Her understanding of Ethan Cross upside down. "Do I know you?" she asked. "You know the man I am now, the man I've been trying to become for the past 4 years. He reached for her hand, then seemed to think better of it, letting his own fall back to his lap. "The question is whether that's enough." Before Julia could answer, the sound of approaching hoofbeats made them both turn. A single rider was coming toward them at a hard gallop, kicking up enough dust to suggest urgency. As the figure drew closer, Julia recognized Doc Harrison, his face grim with whatever news had brought him racing down the road. "Ethan! Julia!" He pulled up beside their wagon, his horse lathered with sweat. "Thank God I found you. You need to come back to town now." "What's happened?" Ethan asked. "Blackwood's called a meeting, says he has information about the bank fire that everyone needs to hear." Doc's eyes darted between them, and Julia could see knowledge there, suspicion and concern mixing into something that made her stomach clench. "He's got half the valley gathered in the church, and he's talking about justice and accountability." "Talking about what, specifically?" Julia asked, though she was afraid she already knew. "Talking about arson. About someone who had motive and opportunity and the skills to pull it off." Doc's voice dropped to a whisper. "He's talking about you, Ethan, and he says he has proof." Julia felt the world tilt around her. Everything she'd thought was settled suddenly thrown back into chaos. Margaret's threats hadn't been idle conversation. They'd been a warning, a preview of what was coming. "What kind of proof?" Ethan asked, his voice deadly calm. "I don't know. But he's got the sheriff with him, and a federal marshal who rode in this morning. They're serious about this, Ethan, dead serious." Julia looked at the man she'd agreed to marry, seeing him perhaps more clearly than ever before, not as a savior or a burden, but as someone who'd risked everything to protect her and was now facing the consequences of that choice. "We could run," she said quietly. "Where would we go, and what kind of life would that be, always looking over our shoulders?" Ethan's smile was sad but determined. "Besides, I'm tired of running from what I've done." "So what do we do?" "We go back to town. We face whatever Blackwood thinks he knows." He gathered the reins, preparing to turn the wagon around. "And we see if the man I've been trying to become is strong enough to survive the man I used to be." As they headed back toward a confrontation that could destroy everything they'd built together, Julia realized that her choice had never really been about accepting or rejecting Ethan's proposal. It had been about deciding what kind of person she wanted to be when everything fell apart. The question was she strong enough to stand by someone who'd burned the world to save her, even if it meant burning with him? The church had never held so many people. Every pew was packed, with overflow crowds standing along the walls and spilling out onto the front steps. The air was thick with tension and the mingled sense of sweat, dust, and the kind of righteous indignation that came when a community felt it had been deceived. Hiram Blackwood stood at the pulpit like some unholy preacher, his pale hands gripping the wooden edges as he surveyed his congregation with satisfaction. To his right sat Sheriff Dawson, a man Julia had known since childhood, but who now regarded her and Ethan with the careful neutrality of someone trying to navigate political waters. To his left stood a stranger, tall, sharp-eyed, with the kind of weathered authority that marked him as the federal marshal Doc Harrison had mentioned. Margaret Cross occupied the front pew like a queen holding court, her black dress and satisfied expression making her look like she was attending a funeral she'd been anticipating for years. Around her sat the other prominent families of the valley, their faces a mixture of curiosity, concern, and barely concealed excitement at the drama unfolding before them. As Julia and Ethan entered, conversations died away like ripples in a pond. Every eye turned toward them, measuring, judging, already reaching conclusions based on rumor and speculation. Julia felt exposed under that collective gaze, but she kept her chin high and her hand firmly clasped in Ethan's as they made their way to an empty space near the back. "Ladies and gentlemen," Blackwood's voice carried easily through the packed space, "thank you all for coming on such short notice. I know many of you have questions about recent events in our community, and I believe it's time those questions were answered." He paused, allowing the tension to build like pressure in a steam kettle. 3 nights ago, our bank was destroyed by fire. This morning, I received information that compels me to speak out about what really happened that night. Julia felt Ethan tense beside her, but his expression remained calm, almost serene. Whatever was coming, he'd made his peace with it. "The fire that destroyed Mr. Peterson's bank was not an accident," Blackwood continued. "It was a deliberate act of arson, committed by someone with both the motive and the expertise to ensure maximum damage while avoiding detection." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, though Julia suspected most people had already reached similar conclusions on their own. Furthermore, Blackwood's voice rose above the whispers. "I have evidence that points to the identity of the person responsible." He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded piece of paper, holding it high enough for everyone to see. "This is a telegram from the War Department in Washington, detailing the military service record of one Ethan Cross." Julia's heart stopped. She looked at Ethan, seeing resignation settle over his features like a shroud. According to these records, Mr. Cross served as a reconnaissance specialist with the 5th Tennessee Infantry. His duties included what the military euphemistically calls demolition work, the destruction of enemy installations, supply lines, and strategic targets. Blackwood's voice carried the satisfaction of a man who'd been holding a winning hand all along. "In layman's terms, ladies and gentlemen, our neighbor, Ethan Cross, is a trained arsonist." The explosion of voices that followed was immediate and chaotic. Some people rose from their seats, others turned to their neighbors with expressions of shock and betrayal. Through it all, Ethan sat perfectly still, neither confirming nor denying the accusations. Sheriff Dawson raised his hand for silence. "That's a serious charge, Mr. Blackwood. But military service, even in demolitions, doesn't make a man guilty of civilian crimes, doesn't it?" Blackwood's smile was sharp as a blade. "Then perhaps you'd like to hear about the other evidence I've gathered." He reached into his coat again, this time producing what looked like a piece of charred metal. This was found in the ruins of the bank, a specialized type of fire starter used by military scouts during the war, not something your average farmer would have access to. Julia felt sick. The evidence was circumstantial, but in a community already primed to believe the worst, it might be enough. "Furthermore," Blackwood continued, "I have a witness who saw Mr. Cross in the vicinity of the bank on the night in question." "Who?" Sheriff Dawson asked. "Billy Henderson. Tell them what you told me, son." Billy stood reluctantly from his position, near the door, his face pale and his hands shaking. I saw someone that night, near the bank. It was dark, but you recognized him, didn't you?" Blackwood prompted. It looked like..." Billy's eyes darted toward Ethan, then away. It could have been Mr. Cross. The height was right, and the way he moved. Could it have been? Sheriff Dawson pressed. Or was it? I can't be certain, Billy admitted miserably. It was too dark to see clearly. Julia felt a flutter of hope. Billy's uncertainty might be enough to create reasonable doubt. But then Blackwood played his final card. Marshal Williams, he said, turning to the federal officer, would you please share what you've discovered about Mr. Cross's recent activities? The marshal stood, his voice carrying the weight of federal authority. Investigation shows that Mr. Cross made several unusual purchases in recent weeks. Kerosene, lamp oil, and certain chemicals that, when combined, create an accelerant similar to those used in military operations. The words hit the crowd like a physical blow. Julia heard gasps, muttered curses, and the scrape of chairs as people shifted away from them as if criminality might be contagious. The evidence is overwhelming, Blackwood declared. Ethan Cross burned down our bank to eliminate his fiancée's debts, using skills learned in service to his country but perverted to serve his own selfish ends. Sheriff Dawson stood slowly, his hand moving toward his holster. Ethan Cross, I'm going to have to ask you to come with me for questioning. This was it. The moment Julia had been dreading since Doc Harrison had found them on the road. Ethan would be arrested, tried, and almost certainly convicted based on evidence that painted a compelling picture of guilt. Even if they couldn't prove it beyond all doubt, the court of public opinion had already rendered its verdict. But instead of standing to surrender, Ethan did something that caught everyone off guard. He began to laugh, not the bitter laughter of a broken man or the desperate hysteria of someone facing ruin. This was something else entirely. Deep, genuine amusement that seemed utterly inappropriate given the circumstances. Is something funny about this situation, Mr. Cross? Marshal Williams asked sternly. Oh, it's hilarious, Ethan said, rising to his feet with unhurried grace. Absolutely hilarious. He turned to face Blackwood, and Julia was startled to see something she'd never seen in his expression before. Predatory satisfaction. You want to know what's funny, Blackwood? It's that you've spent all this time building a case against me for burning down the bank when you should have been asking yourself a much more important question, which is why a man with my particular skills would leave evidence behind. Ethan's smile was sharp enough to cut. Did you really think I'd be sloppy enough to drop military equipment at the scene? That I'd be seen by witnesses or leave a trail of suspicious purchases? Blackwood's confidence wavered slightly. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that you've been played, Hiram. Played by someone who wanted you to find exactly the evidence you found, who wanted you to reach exactly the conclusions you've reached. Ethan's voice carried through the sudden silence like a bell. The question is, who had access to military surplus equipment? Who could plant evidence in the ruins of a burned building? Who had both the motive and the resources to frame me for a crime I didn't commit? Julia felt the atmosphere in the room shift as people began to follow Ethan's logic to its inevitable conclusion. You're suggesting someone framed you, Sheriff? Dawson asked. I'm not suggesting anything. I'm stating facts. Ethan reached into his own coat and withdrew a folded document. This is a bill of sale dated 2 weeks ago for several items of military surplus equipment, including the fire starter Blackwood showed you. He paused, letting the tension build. It's signed by Hiram Blackwood. The silence that followed was absolute. Julia could hear her own heartbeat, could hear the whisper of wind through the church's windows, could hear the collective intake of breath as an entire community realized they'd been watching the wrong play unfold. That's impossible, Blackwood sputtered. You never thought anyone would check, Ethan interrupted. You were so confident in your plan, so certain that my military record would be enough to convict me in the court of public opinion, that you got careless. Marshal Williams stepped forward, hand extended. May I see that document? Ethan handed it over, his expression calm as the marshal examined it carefully. This appears to be genuine, William said after a moment. Official Federal Surplus Office. Seal, proper documentation. It's a forgery, Blackwood declared, but his voice had lost its earlier authority. Is it? Ethan asked mildly. Then you won't mind if the marshal checks with the Surplus Office in Austin? They keep very detailed records of all sales. Blackwood's face had gone pale, and Julia could see sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool air in the church. Furthermore, Ethan continued, you might want to ask yourself why Mr. Blackwood was so eager to buy Miss Mitchell's debt from the bank. Why did he make his offer the day after visiting with certain prominent members of this community who had their own reasons for wanting to see our engagement prevented? All eyes turned toward Margaret Cross, who had gone very still in her front pew seat. Are you accusing my sister of conspiracy? Margaret asked, her voice icy. I'm not accusing anyone of anything, Ethan replied. I'm simply pointing out that some people benefit greatly from chaos and confusion. Some people profit when small ranchers lose their land to foreclosure. Some people have reasons to want their family members' romantic entanglements to end badly. Sheriff Dawson was looking between Blackwood and Margaret with growing suspicion. Marshal Williams, I think we need to expand our investigation. Wait, Julia said, standing suddenly. All eyes turned to her, and she felt the weight of the entire community's attention. There's something you all need to know. Ethan looked at her sharply, a warning in his expression, but she pressed on. Ethan didn't burn down the bank, she said clearly. I did. The explosion of voices that followed was deafening. People leaped to their feet, shouting questions and accusations. Through it all, Julia stood perfectly still, her hand clasped tightly in Ethan's. Julia, no, he said quietly. Don't do this. Why not? She turned to face him, seeing love and desperation and fear all mixed together in his expression. You were willing to let them arrest you for something you didn't do. You were willing to sacrifice yourself to protect me from the consequences of my own actions. Because I love you, and I love you too. The words came out stronger than she'd intended, carrying clearly through the chaos around them. Which is why I'm not going to let you pay for my choices. She turned back to face the crowd, raising her voice above the din. I burned down the bank because I was desperate and angry and tired of watching everything my family built slip away because of forces beyond my control. Ethan tried to stop me, tried to talk me out of it, but I wouldn't listen. It was a lie, and they both knew it. But it was a lie told out of love, the kind of sacrifice that came naturally when someone you cared about was in danger. Julia. Ethan's voice was soft, but it carried an authority that cut through all the noise. Stop talking. She looked at him, seeing something in his expression that made her breath catch. Not fear, not desperation, but the kind of quiet determination she'd come to associate with moments when he'd made up his mind about something important. No more lies, he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. No more games, no more protecting each other from the truth. He turned to face the crowd, and when he spoke, his voice carried the kind of unshakable certainty that comes from finally accepting who you are. I burned down the bank. I planned it. I executed it. And I'd do it again if it meant protecting the woman I love from men like Hiram Blackwood, who think they can buy and sell people's lives like commodities. The silence that followed was complete. But here's what Mr. Blackwood and his conspirators didn't count on, Ethan continued. They thought that exposing my past would destroy me and would turn this community against me. They thought that fear would make me weak. He stepped forward, and Julia was amazed to see that people actually moved back from him, as if his quiet intensity was something physical. They were wrong. I'm not ashamed of what I did during the war because I did it to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. I'm not ashamed of what I did to the bank because I did it for the same reason, and I'm not ashamed of who I am because I'm a man who doesn't abandon the people he loves when things get difficult." His eyes found Julia's, and the love she saw there took her breath away. "I told you once that I wasn't going anywhere, Julia. I meant that. Not when your ranch was failing, not when my sister tried to break us apart, not when powerful men with money and influence decided we were obstacles to be removed." His voice grew stronger, more certain. "I'm not going anywhere, ever." Sheriff Dawson cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Mr. Cross, I still have to arrest you for the bank fire." "I understand," Ethan nodded calmly. "But before you do, I think you should know that Marshal Williams isn't the only federal officer investigating this situation." All eyes turned to the marshal, who was suddenly looking very uncomfortable. "3 weeks ago," Ethan continued, "I contacted the Territorial Attorney General's office about suspicious land acquisition practices in this valley. Turns out they'd already been investigating reports of fraud, coercion, and conspiracy involving certain prominent businessmen." Blackwood had gone white as a sheet. That's not... "The investigation is ongoing," Marshal Williams said, reluctantly, "and certain evidence has come to light that suggests a pattern of illegal activities designed to force small landowners to sell their properties below market value." "What kind of evidence?" Sheriff Dawson asked. "Forged documents, intimidation tactics, conspiracy to defraud." The marshal's voice was grim. "The kind of evidence that carries federal penalties." Julia watched as the tables turned completely. Blackwood, who had seemed so confident just minutes before, was now backing toward the church door like a trapped animal. Margaret Cross was staring straight ahead, her face a mask of cold fury. "Mr. Blackwood," Marshal Williams said formally, "I'm going to have to ask you to come with me for questioning regarding federal fraud charges." "This is ridiculous," Blackwood exploded. "I'm a respected businessman. I won't be railroaded by the same legal system you tried to use against Mr. Cross." The marshal's smile was thin. "Justice works both ways, sir." As federal agents moved in to arrest Blackwood, Julia felt Ethan's hand tighten around hers. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. "Now we face whatever comes next together," he said, "just like we promised." Sheriff Dawson approached them, his expression troubled but not unsympathetic. "I'm still going to have to take you in, Ethan. Bank burning is a serious crime, even if your motives were understandable, I know. But given the circumstances and the new information about Mr. Blackwood's activities, I suspect the territorial judge will take a lenient view of things." Julia felt a flicker of hope. "What does that mean?" "Means maybe community service instead of prison time, maybe a fine instead of hanging." Sheriff Dawson's smile was small but genuine. "Especially if the community feels that justice has already been served in other ways." Julia looked around the church, taking in the faces of neighbors and friends who had watched this entire drama unfold. Some still looked shocked, others confused. But she also saw something else: approval, grudging respect, and in some cases, outright admiration for a man who'd been willing to risk everything to protect someone he loved. "There's one more thing," Ethan said, turning to address the crowd. "One final time. I want everyone here to understand something. What I did alone. Julia had nothing to do with the bank fire, and anyone who suggests otherwise will answer to me personally." The quiet threat in his voice was unmistakable, and Julia felt a fierce pride in the man who was willing to stand between her and any consequences his actions might bring. "Now," he said, offering his hands to Sheriff Dawson, "I believe you need to arrest me." But before the sheriff could respond, Doc Harrison stood up in the middle of the church. "I have something to say," the old doctor announced, "about what really happened the night of the bank fire." Every eye turned to him, and Julia felt her heart skip a beat. "I was with Mr. Peterson that night, treating him for chest pains at his home, which is why he went to the bank so late, to retrieve some important papers he needed for his will." Doc's voice carried easily through the silent church. "Mr. Peterson asked me to tell the truth about what we saw that night, but he was too scared to speak up himself." "What truth?" Marshal Williams asked. "The truth about who really started that fire." Doc looked directly at Blackwood, who was now handcuffed and being held by federal agents. "We saw you, Hiram. You and 2 of your men spreading accelerants around the building. You set that fire to destroy evidence of your fraud, and you would have let an innocent man hang for it." The final revelation hit the crowd like a thunderclap. Julia felt her knees go weak with relief, while beside her Ethan closed his eyes, as if a weight he'd been carrying for days had finally been lifted from his shoulders. "Peterson was too frightened to come forward," Doc continued. "Said Blackwood had threatened him and his family if he talked. But he couldn't stand by and watch an innocent man be railroaded for a crime he didn't commit." Sheriff Dawson turned to Ethan with something that might have been an apology in his expression. "Looks like you're free to go, son." But Ethan shook his head. "Not yet. There's still one more thing that needs to be said." He turned to face Julia, and she was surprised to see nervousness in his expression for the first time since this whole ordeal had begun. "Julia Mitchell," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the packed church, "you've seen me at my worst today. You've learned things about my past that would make any reasonable woman run in the opposite direction. You've watched me be accused of serious crimes and seen me prepared to sacrifice everything rather than abandon you." "Ethan, let me finish." His smile was soft, tender. "You've seen all of that, and you're still standing here beside me. You were willing to confess to a crime you didn't commit to protect me from the consequences of my own choices." He dropped to one knee right there in front of the entire community, just as he had on her porch, what felt like a lifetime ago. "So I'm asking you again, in front of God and everyone we know, Julia Mitchell, will you marry me? Will you build a life with a man who's not perfect, who's made mistakes, who comes with a past that's complicated and a future that's uncertain? Will you take a chance on us, on this crazy, dangerous, beautiful thing we've found together?" Julia looked down at him, this man who'd been willing to burn the world to save her, who'd stood up to powerful enemies to protect her, who'd faced arrest and imprisonment rather than let her take the blame for his actions. She thought about all the ways he'd proven his love, not with words but with choices, not with promises but with sacrifice. "Yes," she said, the word coming out strong and clear and utterly certain. "Yes, I'll marry you, but only if you promise me one thing. Anything. Promise me that we'll face whatever comes next together. No more protecting each other from the truth. No more carrying burdens alone. Whatever happens, we face it as partners. Partners." He agreed, standing and pulling her into his arms. Always partners. When he kissed her, the entire church erupted in cheers and applause. Even Margaret Cross managed a grudging smile, though whether it was for their happiness or relief that the drama was finally over, Julia couldn't tell. As they broke apart, Julia realized that this was what she'd been searching for all along, without knowing it. Not someone to save her, not someone to complete her, but someone to stand beside her through whatever storms life might bring. "I love you," she whispered against his lips. "I love you too," he whispered back. "And I'm not going anywhere, ever." Outside, the sun was setting over Clearwater Valley, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. It was the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The close of a story about pride and fear and the walls people build to protect themselves. But more than that, it was the beginning of a story about love. The kind of love that chooses partnership over independence, trust over fear, and standing together over standing alone. The kind of love that refuses to let go, No matter what storms may come, the kind of love that says, I'm not going anywhere ever, and means it with every breath, every heartbeat, every choice that follows. And in the gathering dusk of a Texas evening, as wedding bells began to ring across the valley, that was exactly the kind of love Julia Mitchell and Ethan Cross had found together. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.